Sunday morning, January 7th, 1906, Chinsegut. Fielder and I sat on the front porch, and he just talked about Raymond for an hour. He kept saying he loved him just like his own. And he told stories about Raymond, how he used to say he loved Fielder and Cousin Lizzie and Sister Bess best of all the world, and how he would jump up and throw his arms around Fielder's neck and hang there when he was so little his feet came just to Fielder's knees. He tells me about getting Raymond's letters last summer and how overjoyed he was, and he went round down there in Palmetto and Manatee County telling everybody, "I've heard from my boy and I'm going to him. Why, I raised him." Welcome to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kaler. This season, we're examining various personal and professional relationships that deeply formed the woman Elizabeth became. Today, we'll learn about Fielder Harris, someone who spent way more time with Elizabeth's brother Raymond than he did with Elizabeth. But Elizabeth's friendship with Fielder shaped her perception of race relations in Florida. Watching how segregation laws affected Fielder and life for everyone else at Chinsegut led Elizabeth to seek a meeting with Booker T. Washington and to write 2 novels broaching the subject. But first, let's meet Fielder. Fielder Harris was born in 1850 in South Carolina. He lived the first 15 years of his life as an enslaved person at Orange Hill Plantation in Abbeville, South Carolina. Following emancipation, he continued to work as a farmhand in South Carolina until he moved to Brooksville, Florida in his early 30s. He found work at Bodine Grove, a citrus farm owned by Kentuckians who had been lured to Florida by the stories of cheap land and a booming citrus industry. The problem was the Bodine Grove owners, Dr. and Mrs. McKay, knew nothing about farming or citrus. Mrs. McKay was struggling to transition to pioneer living, and Dr. McKay didn't appear to have the interest or the energy required to farm Florida land. Fielder soon became the key to the McKays' success. When he'd been at Bodine Grove for 2 years, the McKay family expanded to include Lizzie's 10-year-old cousin, Raymond Robbins. The Robbins family had hit hard financial times, and their 7 children were split up to go live with various relatives. Raymond was the youngest in the Robbins family. He'd suffered unexplained seizures as a child, so he hadn't been sent to school. As he decided where to send each of his children, Raymond's father thought a life of physical labor would be best for him. At first, Raymond followed Fielder around the farm out of boredom, but before long fell in love with agricultural life and all Fielder could teach him. The two became inseparable. For the rest of their lives, Fielder would refer to Raymond as "my boy," and Raymond considered Fielder his primary father figure. Raymond would later write, "Fielder had the unbound confidence of my foster mother, and he was, during those impressionable years, my closest associate. His mind was filled with the immemorial wisdom of the field and farm, forest and stream. A wise fisherman and a mighty hunter. He was the best axeman, oarsman, runner, wrestler, and jumper in the county. He was the master of horsemanship, broke the wildest of mules, tamed range cattle, and was altogether my ideal for those 7 years." Although uneducated, Raymond was a highly intelligent and inquisitive child. He was also a dreamer. The child would tell Fielder that he was going to earn a large fortune. He would then buy Snow Hill, which was the largest plantation in Hernando County, and bring Fielder there to run it with him. Raymond started his fortune-building plan at age 15, when Dr. McKay gave him 5 acres. With Fielder's help, Raymond cleared the land and planted 400 orange trees the young man had grown from buds himself. But freezes in the 1890s would decimate the Bodine Grove citrus crop, and the McKays abandoned the farm and returned to Kentucky. Fielder and Raymond pursued other opportunities and lost touch for several years. Before we learn more about Fielder, we're going to talk to Fred Hearns. He's the curator of Black History at the Tampa Bay History Center. Besides their museum in Tampa, the center also operates Elizabeth's home as Chinsegut Hill Historic Site. Fred and I share the same undergrad degree, English and journalism, and I think it's so fun that it led us to the same sort of work that led us to this podcast talk today. He went on to earn 2 master's degrees, one in organizational management and leadership, and one in Africana studies. So, Mr. Hearns, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yes, Natalie, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this project. My name is Fred Hearns, and I was born in the Bronx, New York, but I grew up in East Tampa, and I still have relatives in New York. I go visit as often as I can, but I'm a Southern kid who grew up in a segregated city in the Deep South, Tampa, Florida.
Okay.
And during the time that I was in grade school, I lived in a neighborhood, all black neighborhood. Walked to school. I only lived a few blocks from my elementary school. It was not uncommon for me to go days at a time without seeing a white face, unless I went to the grocery store in our neighborhood, which was owned by an Italian family. I wouldn't see white people in my community. All of the teachers at my school were black. The principal, all the administrators, of course, the support staff, all black. All the students were black. All of my neighbors, everyone I would come in contact with, again, unless I went to the store in our community, which was just 2 blocks away from my grandmother's home. I lived with my mother and my grandmother until I was in 7th grade, and then moved to another neighborhood not too far away from the first community I lived in, which was also segregated, just 2 blocks north of Georgia's Middleton High School, where I attended high school. So growing up in the 1950s, I was born in 1948. So I pretty much grew up in the 1950s and 60s in Tampa during the days when everything was pretty much segregated. The first white teacher at my high school came in 1965. I was in his homeroom, so I got to see him every day, Mr. Thomas Harris. And it was, I guess, sort of predictable that he would be the one to kind of break the ice and be the first white teacher at Middleton High School, the black high school in East Tampa, because he taught for years in the Chicago public school district. So he was accustomed to teaching black kids. It was nothing new to him, but he was certainly new to us. And but he fit right in, and he made us feel comfortable. And after a while, you forgot what color he was. He just kind of blended right in. But again, it was because of his experiences up in Chicago. So again, stayed at home, went to USF, commuted for 4 years. As you said, majored in English journalism. For the first 4 years, I did work as a newspaper journalist, starting with the black newspaper in Tampa, the Florida Sentinel Bulletin. At that time, it was published twice a week. It's now a weekly black newspaper, one of the few that survived in the South. A lot of black newspapers went out of business for financial reasons, primarily. Then after journalism, worked for 4 years in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at Southern University in the Office of Public Contacts, and came back home to visit late in 1974. And one of the people I went to see was Alton White, who had run for mayor in Tampa. He didn't win, but he threw his support to the eventual winner of the mayor's position. And so I went to see Alton White, congratulate him being an executive assistant to Mayor Bill Polk. And Alton offered me a job. I never even thought about coming back to Tampa to live, but he offered me a job working for the city of Tampa. I accepted. My wife and I came back to Tampa. She never lived here before. And so I've been here ever since, worked 32 and a half years for the city of Tampa, retired as director of the Department of Community Affairs. We did EEO work, fair housing investigations, police community relations work, and so forth. I retired as director of that department. Then I did tours, Black History tours, bus tours, walking tours for the next 13 years. Went back to grad school, got 2 grad degrees, and the Tampa Bay History Center offered me the position of curator of Black history. It was a new position. that was created around 2020 and came to work in 2020, 2021. And so I've been here ever since. And again, working at Chinsegut Hill, primarily for Emancipation Day celebrations around May 20th every year. So that's a quick summary of what I've been doing for the last several years.
Yeah, and I believe the first time we met was at one of the Emancipation Proclamation celebrations, but probably the first one, which takes us to our subject for today, which is Fielder Harris. He was born an enslaved person and then received his freedom from the Emancipation Proclamation. Help us to understand how people found out about emancipation and what that meant for enslaved people, because people get confused about the date it was released and then all of the dates that people celebrate it. So can you just kind of walk us through that?
So I confess that I'm probably one of the people who's added to the confusion over these dates when freedom came to formerly enslaved Black people in Florida. It was important that people, as many people as possible, knew that May 20th, 1805 is the official date for liberation of enslaved Black people in Florida, because it was on that date, May 20th, that the Emancipation Proclamation was read to all of those who were assembled in Tallahassee around the Knott House by General McCook. The liberation came to Florida really at the time that the Union Army was in a position to enforce freedom. Mm. We all know that the Emancipation Proclamation that Abraham Lincoln issued, it was written in 1862, and he sort of gave the South a warning of several months that if the enslaved were not liberated and if not in, he was going to free all enslaved persons on January 1st, 1863. He met several months before then. Of course, the Confederates ignored the continued to fight the Union Army. And so there were people who did on January 1st, 1863, but for the most part, they were not enslaved in the Deep South. You know, slavery did exist in many parts of the United States beyond just Confederacy, but they continued to fight for 2 more years. And so freedom came again when the Union Army was in a position to enforce freedom in those nations. So in Florida, officially, slavery ended on May 1865 because the Union Army was in a position to enforce throughout most of the state.
Okay, that's really helpful. And so then you started an Emancipation Day celebration at Chinsegut a few years ago. Yesterday, after I'd sent you your questions, I actually found a letter from Margaret Robbins to Elizabeth written on May 20th of 1924, so exactly 100 years ago, and I thought that I would read you a couple sentences from it. She writes, "This is Emancipation Day, and except Fielder, there is no one left on the place. They've gone to celebrate the great Jubilee. Lizzie Washington came early this morning and told again the tale of the day when freedom came." And I thought that was so cool because we know that Elizabeth Carr Washington was there at Chinsegut the day that the proclamation was read. This celebration that Margaret refers to was 59 years after Lincoln issued the proclamation. This year, 2024, we're 159 years out from it. Why did you start the Commemoration Day? Why did you think it was important for us to continue to celebrate it? And is there a reason you particularly wanted it done at Chinsegut?
Yes, I thought it was important to bring that celebration to Central Florida, to Hernando County, because it's been celebrated widely in Leon County, all around Tallahassee for many, many years. Mm-hmm. I think since the late 1900s, it's been a paid holiday for Leon County employees. And so I've been to the celebration times in Tallahassee, It's a pretty big deal in Tallahassee. Close to people celebrate emancipation on May 20th. They have a reenactment of the Emancipation Proclamation, which we've done twice in Hernando County. They also have bands, they have food, they have vendors, celebration. And it's held in the same block where the Proclamation was read back in 1865. So the first time I attended, and I learned a lot of history I was not aware of, we need to bring this celebration down further south.
Mm.
Now, the first thing I did was bring it to Tampa, because Tampa had a different date for liberation of enslaved people here. It's documented that on May 6, 1864, a whole year before the proclamation was read in Tallahassee, 1864, on May 6, freedom came to the enslaved in Tampa, because that is the Union Army invaded Tampa. Tampa was, of course, Confederacy, and captured a military fort here, Fort Brooke. Confederates had taken their positions, but on that, most of the army, the Confederate Army, was away on a cattle drive. And word came through a spy to the Union Army that one here to defend the fort. And so when the Union Army and the Union Navy also coordinated invasion and the capture of Tampa, when it was around midnight, May 5th, but the actual invasion took place on May. There was very little resistance. No one was killed. Some people were. So that's the date that we began celebrating liberation in Tampa. Several celebrations, and now it's an annual event. We've made it part of the Tampa Center activities to have a May 6th celebration in Tampa. Again, because that's when the Union Army arrived, that's when it could be enforced. I don't know if that's new information to you.
No, that's really great information. And I think will really help clarify, because there was so much confusion when everybody started talking about Juneteenth all of a sudden. And then, of course, we had the May date, and you're hearing all these different dates, and you've really helped clarify that. Following emancipation, we enter what has been called the Reconstruction period. What was the government trying to do, and how did that work in Florida?
Reconstruction in Florida, similar to Reconstruction throughout the South, where after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made it possible for a lot of things to happen. One of those things were the freedom, where we had Blacks for the first time attending school, Blacks who were appointed by new state officials, the Republican, which was the Liberal Party at that time, most of the positions of power. And so Black people were appointed to positions of responsibility in local government for the first time in the 1860s, including on the school board. The first Black person appointed position in Tampa was Frederick Newberry, who was appointed what we now would call the supervisor of elections office.
Okay.
So he was making sure that the votes were cast fairly and that they were all counted. This was the first Black man in a political position. So this happened all over the state of Florida during Reconstruction.
Yeah, in Hernando, we had a county commissioner that was appointed, Arthur St. Clair, who still has descendants in the area today. And he was the only one I've found so far that was appointed in this area, but he was a pretty influential person.
Right. So Reconstruction, which only lasted about 12 years, it kind of officially ended in 1877. To open the door for Blacks for the first time to go to school. First time they could actually marry. It was against the law, slave persons to marry each other until slavery ended.
Okay.
One first things that many of the Black people did when they got their freedom was to try to reunite family members, many of whom had been sold away to plantations, other parts of the country even. Some were not even in Florida. And they went searching these lost members of the families. Many people did. This was the beginning of family. This is actually how family reunions began, with the formerly enslaved family members and getting married, and for the first time being able to own property. That was one of the things that excited me about what I began to learn Chinsegut Hill, where Black people who had been enslaved, many of them actually own property there in Hernando County, around Chinsegut. And just imagine being enslaved, not having any rights, to one day actually becoming a property owner.
On land that you used to have to work for free. Yeah, that's pretty great redemption arc.
Yes, actually. And so with the recent archaeological studies that we've done, we found evidence of where we believe those cabins were located. Black people for the first had real hope that they could live lives that were productive, make their own decisions, and earn their own money, and began to prosper, and their children as well as themselves. Because when the schools opened, many of the adults attended school. They didn't know how to read or write.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only did children educated, they wanted education for themselves. Many of them did. But again, 1977, the redemption period began. Redemption, because this was sort of when the South began to rise again, I guess you could. And many of those Blacks who had held office were relieved of those offices. And, we had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and Black Code. That's when, states began to rewrite their constitutions and enforce Jim Crow.
Yeah, so let's get into that. So we start into the adoption of Jim Crow laws. What are they, and what is a less offensive term to use when referring to them?
Well, they with what we could call the Black Codes and Black Code rules. In some cases, they went on to become in the state constitutions of the former Confederacy. Restrictions, many of the same restrictions that existed during slavery, except now, of course, the slavery as we knew it existed. But what the Confederate States did was put into their constitutions laws that greatly movement of Black people. It restricted ownership of, it restricted educational opportunities. Believe it or not, one of the first states to enforce something that called a Black Code at the time was the state of Massachusetts. Wasn't the Deep South. Of course, the state that we most commonly point to as the first state that rewrote its constitution and saw a blueprint for the Black codes was the state of Mississippi.
Okay.
And they did take the lead in many of those areas, but Mass actually was the first state that actually had what we could call a Black code as it came to transportation, movement back and forth on railroad cars, and separating Black separate cars, and no Black waiting rooms where they could have the same comforts as white passengers. Blacks could eat in the railroad stations other than food they brought. And so, but that was sort of the way that state illegal for blacks to have freedom of movement. And it sort of undid many of the rights that blacks received in 13th, 14th, and 15th, right after the Civil War.
So would the term Jim Crow laws and segregation, are they the same thing or different?
Well, segregation had become a way of life. And while it may not have been part of state laws or the state constitution, when the adoption of all of these restrictions were made part of state law, the Jim Crow laws, I think, more stringent or far-reaching than just segregation. Segregation was more custom, but when it becomes a law and becomes part of the state constitution, then there are defined penalties for violating that law. Fines, imprisonment, lashes, all of that was part of state law. So that was part of the black codes and laws that these states passed. So it went much farther than just segregation. Was more of a informal custom.
Okay, that's helpful. How would the Jim Crow laws then have practically impacted somebody's day?
Well, I can tell you how they impacted my day. Because, I didn't live in the 1800s, but again, growing up in the 1940s and 1950s during segregation, here's some of the things that I can do today. Growing in Tampa or Tampa Bay, as we know it, on the Gulf of Mexico, I could not go to the beaches, as we certainly can. Blacks were restricted from going to beaches in the Gulf of Mexico. What we did, and there were very few swimming pools where blacks could go and enjoy themselves. As it happened, there was a swimming pool that opened to blacks in the 1950s in East Tampa, in historic Belmont Heights, the neighborhood I grew up in. So I was fortunate in that regard. I actually walked to a swimming pool where blacks were allowed to pay, but the beaches were definitely off limits. Unless you had a job on the beaches, working in a restaurant or a hotel, or maybe someone who lived on the board you as a housekeeper or whatever, or a chauffeur. Other than that, go to the beach. I never went to the beaches until I was in college.
Wow.
I was, in the late 1960s. There was one when I was a child in all of Hillsborough County. Little areas out in the rural section of the county where there was no enforcement. But in the city of, just talk about the city of Tampa, there was only one park Black people could go enjoy themselves when I was growing up in the 1950s.
Okay.
That was Rogers Park, which was on the north end of Tampa. Eventually became a golf course, and now it's Rogers Park Golf Course, named for a Black man, Garfield DeVoe Rogers. We could go down on Franklin Street. Of course, we didn't have malls in the 1950s, but we could go down and shop with our parents, or we could go alone. But there was no sit down in any of the department stores in downtown Tampa. Most of them had lunch counters. We could not sit down at the lunch counters, eat a hot dog or hamburger, order a Coke or a cup of coffee. None of that. You could buy pretty much anything on the menu, buy it to go. So you got your sandwiches in a brown paper bag, you got your drinks in a plastic cup, and you kept moving. Nowhere for you to sit.
And did you just know this intuitively, or did people have to tell you, like, was it written somewhere that you couldn't sit?
I don't recall seeing signs saying white only in the doors, but we knew the rules because they were the same rules our parents grew up in Tampa. And so our parents prepared us before we left home. There was nowhere for you to use the bathroom on Franklin Street or Mall. I mean, that was our downtown. So you had to use the restroom before you left home. There were one or two exceptions to that, but primarily for Black people who were working downtown. But if you knew where this room was, you might be able to use it. But our parents trained us never to go downtown having to use the restroom. Make sure you use it before. There was a Black space where we could sit down at lunch counters, Central Avenue, which was a 10 minute away from downtown. So that was where most Black people did our shop. There was also, we couldn't go to movie theaters until 1964, I think it was, when the movie theaters in Tampa desegregated. So we did have 2 Black movie theaters to go to in the Central Avenue area, and there was a Black movie theater in Tampa. Other than that, we didn't go, and nobody tried to see if they could get away with breaking these rules until 1960. That's when the sit-ins were held in Tampa, and that's when things began to change.
So when did the Black Code and the segregation laws actually end?
It was 1964 when the 1964 Civil Rights became law, federal law. And even then, many of the businesses resisted opening their doors to Black people or allowing Black people lunch counters and so forth. We still had to test the law. So that ends as late as probably 1964 with making sure that the merchants who had restricted Black people from sitting, from using their restrooms, from having the same privilege customers had, it probably took about another year after 1960 before everybody opened their doors and we could use the restrooms, we could drink out of the rooms. I don't remember the signs, but there were signs. I was too young to go downtown that would say white only or colored. I know that at the train station, we actually have a photo. It's a Burgett Brothers photo that's all of the libraries have access to the Burgett Brothers photos that do say white and colored at the entrances, which would have been the waiting rooms at the train. So I do remember seeing those signs when I was a child in the 50s. My mother would put me on a train. I would go visit my grandmother in every summer in the late 1950s and early 1960s. I remember seeing the white and colored signs over the waiting stations at the train. It was the mid 1960s before things really, and that was because of the federal law that eventually the local merchants, and not just the merchants, but also government had to obey the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And one of the jobs I had with the city of Tampa, I was human rights director for the city of Tampa. And that was my job to make it was enforced within the city limits.
Something that you just said is really important. You're talking about the 60s. And when I did the research here in Brooksville on segregation laws, we actually had one of the last laws passed. It was in the late 40s that really basically kept anybody that was Black from living in the city. You were allowed to work here, but that was it. And those laws were not rescinded until 1974, which is within my lifetime. So that to me is so important because it shows that anybody my age or older is old enough to remember when that separation existed, and also just the way that you teach your kids about where are safe spaces to be and not safe spaces to be. It shows to me like why it's still history in real time, because it's people that are still around, like you and me.
Yes, correct. In 1968, we had a fair housing law that became law, but it still took years for people to obey the law, to follow the law, and even today, there are still enforcement activities going on. People have been, but I know with the city of Tampa, every year we had a fair housing testing program. White people and Black people out to apply for apartments. This was not just to get apartments.
Mm-hmm.
And they would come back and be debriefed, and they would tell the difference in treatment. And many of those experiences they had, where the white person told $500 deposit, and you can move in 2 weeks, and the person may be told $1,000 department, and we might have something in a month. Still going on today, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So one of the last laws in the state of Florida that you could say was a code or a Jim Crow law was in Sarasota, that restricted Black people from going to the beaches. 1967.
So if somebody is interested in learning more about Reconstruction or segregation or the Black codes, what resource do you recommend most that people look into?
Well, I would say the research library at the University of South Florida is to find documentation on Jim Crow laws in the state of, and the Black codes and so forth, the history of those, and began to change, which was in the 60s. We also have a research library in the public library in Hillsborough County, the Robert W. Saunders African American Research Library, which is a public library. All the services there are free. They actually have a research librarian there. Pose the question like that. She'd help you find, document that gives you information, dates, people of plaintiffs who filed lawsuits, how these things took place. It's not that difficult to find. So the information is there. The Tampa Bay History Center, we also have a library where we have information, and if we don't have it, public library usually does. The University of South Florida, which is a great resource.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing not just all of your knowledge of the subject, but also your personal experiences. I think that's going to be really helpful to people, and look forward to working with you on lots more things at Chinsegut.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it, and have a great day.
You too. Thank you, Fred. Now that Fred has helped us understand the world Fielder was living in, let's return to his story. In December 1904, Raymond returned to Brooksville. His dream property, Snow Hill, was for sale. The manor house had been hit by a tornado 7 years earlier and had been abandoned and left in disrepair. Raymond's oldest sister, Elizabeth, fronted the $5,000 required to purchase the property and renovate the house. In 2024, that's the equivalent of about $179,000. Elizabeth and Raymond renamed the property Chinsegut, an Inuit word that means spirit of lost things. It was to be a place where the siblings would live together and reestablish the joint home they'd been denied as children. Raymond's first and foremost goal was to find Fielder. He wrote every post office in Florida. One morning soon after, Fielder made the trip from his home in Palmetto, Florida to Chinsegut. As Raymond retells the story, he and his wife Margaret were sitting inside their house. Raymond heard footsteps, recognized Fielder's gait, jumped up and declared, "That's Fielder!" He ran outside to greet his long-lost friend. Fielder immediately consented to relocate to Chinsegut and expertly guided Raymond through the manor restoration and in planning out the farm. Chinsegut was not the Robins' full-time home. Raymond ran a settlement house in Chicago and served on the city school board. His wife Margaret traveled extensively in her position as president of the National Women's Trade Union League. Elizabeth's acting career had led her to purchase a home near London, So the first few years after Elizabeth purchased Chinsegut, their visits were limited to a few months a year. In their absence, Fielder managed the staff and operations. He lived in the manor house when the Robins weren't there. He also kept Raymond's friend, William Fulton, up to date on all progress. William would then handle any financial and legal decisions needing immediate action. Fielder's position of authority at Chinsegut did not go over well with some members of the community. His job didn't violate the letter of local segregation laws, but it certainly violated the spirit. In a letter to Elizabeth, Raymond wrote, "We are face to face with a race problem. It was intimated to me when I was last in Florida that I had better get a white man to be foreman of my place, that it was not good for Fielder to have such a position. I replied that I was my own foreman and that Mr. Fulton was my representative. But the fact that Fielder rode my horse Dixie, that he drove on occasion in my buggy, and that he sleeps in the big house has doubtless been too much for the dignity and pride of the Cracker spirit." Raymond ignored his neighbor's advice, and months later, an arsonist sent Raymond and Fielder a message. As soon as daylight broke on June 13th, 1907, the 57-year-old Fielder Harris mounted the horse he'd borrowed from their neighbor Ernest Snow and headed for Brooksville. The acrid smell of sulfur and burnt pine, combined with the lingering smoke, made the horse hesitate as they passed the pile of ash and debris on his right. Only 8 hours before, that pile had been a barn, filled with grain, farm equipment, and their horse Dixie. All had been lost in the fire. The smell of smoke made Fielder's eyes water and he coughed. So did Ernest's horse. Fielder started to use his sleeve to wipe his eyes, but realized the soot-stained shirt wouldn't help him very much. He thought about going back to the house to change, but decided it was more important to get to William Fulton as soon as possible. He knocked on the Fulton's door, which was soon opened by William's 12-year-old daughter, Edith. She invited him in, but he declined on account of the sight and smell of his clothing, so she went back in to fetch her father. Fielder sat on the porch steps to wait, put his head in his hands, and began to cry. When William came out, he sat next to Fielder, placed his hand on the man's shoulder, and said nothing until Fielder raised his head. The two men sat in silence for a few minutes, and then Fielder told him of the barn fire and his efforts to stop it. Fielder told William he would rather think it was caused by his own carelessness than to believe it was set by someone, but he was sure he could not have done it. As Fielder and William sat on the front porch after the fire, they discussed their next steps, the first of which was that both men would write to Raymond. These are the words Fielder sent to Raymond on June 13th, 1907. "I'm in great distress this morning. The barn, buggy, wagon, horse, and everything burned down this morning about 2 o'clock. I heard the roaring and ran out. I thought it was the storm when I first awoke and ran out onto the west top porch, and I found it was the barn. My wife asked me if Dixie was in there, and I said yes. Then she said, 'Run, I believe I hear him hollowing now,' which I did. And when I got there, the shell only of the barn was standing and the top falling in on the horse. I watered and fed him at 5:30 yesterday evening, and there was no sign of fire anywhere. Mrs. Snow was up at 1 a.m. She said she saw no signs of fire anywhere. Raymond, dear boy, I didn't allow any matches to be handled in or around the barn anywhere, and I really can't account for the fire unless it was set on fire. Looking at the poor horse burn, and knowing that neither you nor myself harmed anyone, and feeling that someone would treat us in such a manner, I could but shed tears. Write Miss Bessie, please, and tell her of the horse and the barn. I'm sorry to have to write to you of such, but let it worry you as little as possible. Hoping you may be successful in your fight there, I am, as ever, yours most faithful, Fielder Harris." Fulton wrote to Raymond the following day with more details. Fielder had been in the barn the previous evening, leaving the equipment cleaned and stored and Dixie fed and brushed. He was awakened in the middle of the night to find the barn engulfed in flames. Their neighbor Ernest Snow arrived shortly after Fielder, but the building was too far gone to save. Inspection the next day indicated the fire had begun in the loft where the oats and the hay were stored. William agreed with Fielder that it had to have been deliberately started and asked Raymond's permission to hire a detective to investigate. When Raymond received William's letter, he immediately telegraphed him, "Take all necessary steps to find the facts. Do this for the protection of our neighbors and friends." Despite their efforts, there was no record of any closure to the mystery. The barn was eventually rebuilt, and Fielder kept sleeping in the manor house and managing the estate. The next winter, in January 1908, Elizabeth came back to Chinsegut to spend a few months, with a desire to smooth their relationship with the community. Fielder doted on Miss Bessie, as he nicknamed her. He took time to accompany her on her daily horse rides and help her dig holes for the trees she was continually planting. Some of those trees still stand on the property today. She named many of her trees as she planted them, and both Raymond and Fielder would write to her detailed reports on how high they had grown or how the circumference and diameter of the trunk had changed. Elizabeth decided to take the whole household to the state fair in Tampa. The following account of that trip is from a letter Elizabeth wrote to a friend. "Well, sir, we had a great time at the fair. We had to go to Brooksville for the night previous on account of needing to make an early start. Our train left for Tampa at 8 a.m. Fielder, of course, had to travel in a black car, but I saw him just before we started, and on our arrival he joined me. I went to the Tampa Bay Hotel, the only decent one, but don't tell the awful fact that it was $7 a day. But it included everything, American fashion. I'm sending you a postcard to show you what it was like. The grounds are very nice, and lo and behold, it turned out that Fielder had helped make them beautiful. He'd worked there when they were doing the planting. I couldn't find Fielder when I got to the fairgrounds with my party, so I just went about and looked at bales of hay and cotton, and masses of pineapples and millions of oranges, a gigantic bamboo that came from the great electrician's garden, Thomas A. Edison. He used to be a neighbor of ours when we lived a little further south in Lee County. Oh, one thing you would have loved, a miniature park, and that was our own Hernando County exhibit, planted with little pine trees, and in a wire netting run, 3 foxes, alive of course, and a deer running about, a good deal astonished to find himself at the fair. There was a rabbit, too, and a squirrel, and some partridges, all living together in the little park. Fielder, you may know, had to go and find the friends he was to stay with, and that took time, so I never saw him till I discovered him at the races. Think of it, he'd never been to one before in all his godly days, and 'twas I had led him into this. Well, I was fearful pleased when I discovered him. I stopped and beckoned, and though there wasn't a race going on at the moment, he never saw. And when I called a second time, he looked round quite bewildered, like a person roused from sleep. So I went climbing over the not very full seats till I got to him, and we discoursed a little, and then the next race began. We saw it together, and we applauded some good riding as though Fielder and I were old sports. We got greatly excited the last time the horses went dashing round and craned our necks, and when a friend of mine asked Fielder at the close if he liked it, Fielder said, "Yes, sir, didn't you hear me holler?" I'm bound to say I didn't, but I rather liked the notion of the staid Fielder being so stirred as to holler at a horse race, with a lady at his side, too. I went away with my white friends. The black attendees are only allowed to sit at the one end. But I saw Fielder at the close and took him through all the various exhibits, and we agreed Hernando County came out very well. I heard he was comfortably lodged, and I told him he must bring his hostess the next day. She was too poor to come at her own expense. I also said that Fielder and his hostess were to be sure to go to the circus, only I made the mistake of calling it the hippodrome. Fielder said, "Yes, ma'am," and he hadn't a glimmer of what a hippodrome was. I looked in vain for him and learned later he hadn't been, but he had a beautiful time at the 10-cent shows, and it's great fun hearing him relate his adventures. There was only one cloud on our horizon. It was the second day, and Fielder had enjoyed himself so much at the races the day before that he appeared there the second afternoon. He saw me that day as I passed, and as soon as he could, he came down in front of the grandstand looking for me. I caught sight of him and made signals, and then called. He stopped and then quietly made his way to me, not troubling anybody. Now, I'd been doubtful the day before whether it would be permitted for a black man to go even along the footway in front of the stand to hunt up Mr. Fulton for me. But Fielder seemed to think he might, and no one stopped him. He returned beaming with one of the Fulton party. So the second day I had no such qualms. I was sitting not far from the bottom, and Fielder didn't have to disturb anybody in order to reach me. He took off his hat and addressed me by my married name. But as he stood there, hat in hand, asking after my health and well-being in the nicest way in the world, a ruffianly-looking white man began to call out to him from behind, "Come out of that! Come down! Ain't allowed there!" I jumped up and said it was all right. I'd called him. but the creature had hold of Fielder's coat and was trying to pull him down. I have seldom felt more angry or more mortified. I said something further to the man and took Fielder's hand. The white man flung back his coat and showed me a badge. "I'm an official," he said, "and it's against the rules." I interrupted him with, "Very well, I'll go down too." So Fielder and I walked all the way back to the end. For we may take their seats, though they may not even stand bareheaded before ours. I could see poor Fielder was dreadfully hurt. I couldn't get him to stay even in the part where he wouldn't have been molested. All the pleasure had gone for him. He went away, and I didn't see him till evening. He referred to the matter the next day as we were driving home. I tried to smooth it over, but he will never forget it, I feel sure. Elizabeth never forgot it either, and it kept her uneasy the next few days. She decided to end her Chinsegut visit early and wired Booker T. Washington to request a meeting so she could better understand segregation laws. Booker was at the height of his influence, creating opportunity for Black Americans in education and industry. He felt it would be a more effective strategy than fighting segregation head-on. Elizabeth most likely had this quick access to the very influential Booker because of his relationship with Theodore Roosevelt and therefore Raymond. President Roosevelt had invited Booker T. Washington for a social gathering at the White House shortly after TR's election. This was unprecedented and really controversial. The invitation brought racist reactions from white supremacists, like South Carolina Senator Benjamin Tillman, who said men like himself would now need to kill 1,000 Black men to counteract TR's dinner invitation. Booker agreed to meet with Elizabeth, and she quickly headed to meet with him. The very next day after their meeting, she sailed back to London and began writing what she calls in her diary her black and white book. She would end up publishing the novel, The Secret That Was Kept, A Study in Fear. The novel explored race relations and lynching in a fictional Florida town with characters very thinly masked, based on people she'd met in Brooksville. This was not her first book on the subject. Before meeting Fielder, Elizabeth had written a novel called The Open Question, A Tale of Two Temperaments, which touched on race relations in the Reconstruction period in both the North and the South. The proceeds from that book are what gave her enough money to buy Chinsegut in 1905. By 1912, Raymond had placed Fielder in even higher authority. A letter from Fielder to Raymond shows Fielder had been given power of attorney over Chinsegut. Yet they seem to have changed their approach in how they presented their relationship to the locals. For example, when Raymond took Fielder to meet Theodore Roosevelt in New York in 1915, their publicly stated reason for the trip north was Fielder's need to see an eye doctor. In writing to Elizabeth, Raymond wrote, "Naturally, I do not tell of his escapades, nor of all he saw and did, not in that benighted land." Although the crowning moment of the men's trip was going to be TR's New York home, it would also include sightseeing trips in Boston and Washington, D.C., as well as family visits in Maine and Long Island. Raymond's nieces and nephews were said to be radiant at the thought of Fielder's visit and have planned to put in the very best guest room, though they're wondering where they can put Uncle Raymond. But before they could all enjoy all the glories of meeting friends and sightseeing, they had to make the tricky journey north. Due to segregation, they could not have their meals at the same room, they could not travel in the same coach, or stay in the same hotel, train, or steamship rooms. Raymond would drop Fielder off and then make arrangements to meet back up with him for the next leg of travel. But the confusion of continually separating resulted in them missing one boat and 2 trains. Raymond described the trip in detail to Elizabeth. Here's what he wrote about their trip in Jacksonville. "I took him to a furnishing house and bought him a light white suit, white shoes, and a light hat. When he was all dressed up, he looked like a distinguished South American diplomat. I then took him to the dock and vessel and showed him just how to get there and then sent him off to get his lunch. He was to have been at the gangplank at 1:30. The boat sailed at 2 p.m. I reached the dock at 25 minutes to 2 and no Fielder in sight. I waited till 1:45, and then I telephoned my hotel thinking he might have gone there under some misunderstanding. He was not there. At 5 minutes to 2, I asked the captain what I should do. He said if I knew where Fielder was or could guarantee his coming, he would wait 5 or 10 minutes. But of course I could not do this, so I had to get out all my luggage, and at 1 minute to 2, I went down the gangplank with all our belongings, and the steamship sailed away down the St. Johns River." I was almost frantic, not only because of my engagements in the North, which I could ill afford to miss, but from fear that Fielder had been taken off somewhere and slugged for his money. I drove rapidly to the hotel and made a personal search for the old man about the lobby and the streets. Then I hired a motor car, intending to search the city for him after notifying the police. Just as I was starting for the police station, I was hailed by the clerk of the hotel and told that Fielder was at the docks. I hurried there and found him wet with perspiration and ready to weep. He'd gotten lost and had missed his way for the docks. He'd asked for directions and had been incorrectly sent to the ferry dock. While I was debating whether or not to stay over for the next boat in 3 days or to go by rail to New York, an agent came out with a suggestion that the boat had 2 hours of slow going in the St. Johns River before getting out to sea, and if I had a fast motor, I could probably reach the mouth of the river before the boat and get on board. I offered $10 to the driver if he got me there in time, or nothing if he did not. He took my challenge and we tore away for 26 miles over all sorts of roads, were blocked at a canal waiting for a lumber boat, and broke the water pump about 5 miles from the sea. The motor finally died completely about 1/2 mile from the beach. We jumped out and, carrying our bags, hurried to the shore and bank at the mouth of the river. There were no houses except a lighthouse and some fishermen's huts. I found signs of life in one of these and pulled a man out of bed who swore famously and then got his clothes on and got interested in what we were trying to do. He said he'd been there 20 years and no boat had ever stopped there in his time. I told him this was a new era and this boat was gonna stop. We loaded our belongings into a fishing boat and stood out to the center of the channel. I told my boatman that he was to stand broadside of the steamer's bow and stay there until she stopped or the last possible minute before we would be swamped. I had gotten an American flag and tied it to a pole. When the steamer came in sight, I began waving my flag and shouting at the top of my lungs. Apparently, she would not stop, and she was within 100 yards of us when she blew her whistle and began to slow down. She never stopped, but as she swept past us under a slow bell, she threw a rope, and we fastened it around the seat in the bow of our little boat, and then using our oars kept her from being swamped alongside of the steamer, and we went on out to sea. Ropes were lowered, and we sent up our bags one at a time, and then on a rope ladder, first Fielder and then I climbed up into the deck of the ship. All the crew and passengers cheered, and the country was saved. Fielder would ultimately get to experience Washington's Capitol, Mount Vernon, and the White House, as well as New York's Zoo, Aquarium, Metropolitan Museum, Woolworths, Coney Island, and the subway. Fielder saw an optometrist in New York, had eye surgery, and received his first pair of spectacles. Raymond then had the pleasure of introducing his 2 mentors to one another. They'd long known each other through Raymond's stories, but in the trophy room of Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt and Fielder Harris at last met in person. While there, TR gave Fielder the shoe cast by the horse that the colonel had ridden under fire in the Spanish-American War. Fielder was speechless. For the rest of his life, the honored possession hung over Fielder's Chinsegut fireplace. After both Raymond and Fielder had passed away, the horseshoe was nailed to Chinsegut's altar oak and can now be found in the Chinsegut Hill Museum. The horseshoe represents the creative efforts of Fielder, Elizabeth, Raymond, TR, Margaret, and others who worked to recognize and celebrate the humanity of all people in an era marked by dehumanizing segregation laws. They are proof that no individual is bound to the ruling morality of the day, but can work to make the world a better place than they entered it. Fielder's daughter, Margaret Robbins Harris, would grow up at Chinsegut and go to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee University to study nursing. Through much of her life, she continued to experience the effects of segregation, but that is a story for another podcast. Thank you for listening to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast, which is made possible with the help of the brilliant minds of our guest experts like Fred Hearns. Would you please consider following and rating the podcast? By following us, you'll be sure not to miss an episode, and rating is a super helpful way to help us spread the word and support all the hard work of the following people. Leif Thomason of Odd Life Studios produced this content, as well as editing, mixing, and mastering it. Kate Hughes and Christy Anderberg, 2 women who preceded me as curators at Chinsegut Hill. Their work to compile Robin's letters from NYU, UF, and USF were incredibly valuable for this particular episode. Elisa Babor and Barry Mindel of Roots Creative Co. designed an easy-to-navigate website and our lovely graphics. Check out the website to find bonus content and photos of Fielder and other Chinsegut residents. Randy Olson of Live Oak Theater wrote and performed our beautiful theme song, Time is Whispering. Thales Library of New York University gave me access to Elizabeth's collection. Those resources are quoted with the kind permission of Independent Age. Find out more about them at independentage.org. Dr. Joanne Gates, Elizabeth's biographer and my first call when I can't find what I'm looking for or I'm confused about what I found. Check out her Elizabeth Robbins web at jsu.edu. And of course, thanks to Fielder, Elizabeth, and Raymond. When I walk the grounds at Chinsegut and smell the tangerine trees and marvel at the trees whose trunks are so wide I can't put my arms around them, I think of Fielder. It's an honor for me to executive produce, write, and host this telling of their story. I want to end with a quote from a letter Raymond wrote to Elizabeth shortly before Fielder's death. Fielder knew me better for a longer time, in more intimate fellowship than any other living soul. I'd hoped for him a happy, mellow old age in the midst of a youth's comfort and beauty that he had helped to build, surrounded by those he loved. And now the old man lies stricken, just when the lines of his labor have met in a most quickening beauty, and the fulfillment seems near at hand for all his arduous days. There seems to be no answer in happiness to this riddle of human life, even for an old man in the land of flowers. When Fielder goes, the last link with the old days of my boyhood that has held over in these last later years will have broken. It is good to think that memory of those intimate years with the old man, when we plowed and hoed and hunted and teamed and camped together, with all the wide experience since, leaves no single bitter taste. Strong of body and fleet of foot, clean-minded and brave-hearted, wise with the immemorial wisdom of action in field and forest and stream, simple and uncorrupted in spirit, with a quite unfaltering faith in the worth of life and in the goodness of God. He combines the longest, closest bond in action and the surest, kindest, safest fellowship of my life. Big sister, little brother is saddened by the thought of an old man stricken and lying helpless amid the beauty of Chinsegut. His passing will leave a void in the life and love of little brother, never to be filled again in this mortal world.